Good morning to all. This is the video lesson on the speech never given by Winston Churchil, presented by Nagavini Invi, Assistant Professor of English. Introduction. Winston S. Churchill period was between 1874 to 1965. He was a British statesman, an orator, and author. He was the twice Prime Minister of United Kingdom from 1940 to 1945 and 1951 to 1955. This speech was delivered at Harrow School in London during the period of the Second World War. Then, the Britain was going through a major crisis. Just 10 months ago, the United Kingdom's air battle with the Nazi regiment had caused a devastating loss to the country. His message in this speech is this: the importance of never surrendering to defeat and hopelessness. However the bleak the situation is, or how mighty the enemy is. ಶತ್ರು ಎಷ್ಟೇ ಶಕ್ತಿಶಾಲಿಯಾಗಿರಲಿ, ಪರಿಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಎಷ್ಟೇ ಕರಾಳವಾಗಿರಲಿ, ಕ್ಲಿಷ್ಟಕರವಾಗಿರಲಿ, ಎಂದಿಗೂ ಸೋಲಿಗೆ, ವೈಫಲ್ಯಕ್ಕೆ ತಲೆಬಾಗಬಾರದು, ಒಳಗಾಗಬಾರದು, ಎದೆಗುಂದಬಾರದು. ಸರಿಯಾದ ಕನ್ನಡ ಪದ ಎಂದರೆ ಎದೆಗುಂದದಿರುವುದು. ನಡೆ ಮುಂದೆ ನಡೆ ಮುಂದೆ ನುಗ್ಗಿ ನಡೆ ಮುಂದೆ, ಜಗ್ಗದೆಯ ಕುಗ್ಗದೆಯ ನುಗ್ಗಿ ನಡೆ ಮುಂದೆ ಎನ್ನುವ ಕನ್ನಡ ಗೀತೆಯಂತೆ. ದ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ನೆವರ್ ಸರೆಂಡರಿಂಗ್ ಟು ಡಿಫೀಟ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಹೋಪ್ಲೆಸ್ನೆಸ್, ಹವೆವರ್ ದ ಬ್ಲೀಕ್ ದ ಸಿಚುಯೇಷನ್ ಈಸ್, ಆರ್ ಹೌ ಮೈಟಿ ದ ಎನಿಮಿ ಈಸ್. The difference between the last and his present visit. He had visited that school a year ago on the invitation of the headmaster to cheer himself and the hearts of few of friends by singing some of their own songs. The headmaster had invited him to cheer them and the students with a song of their own. Since then, the world has seen very terrible catastrophic events, ups and downs, and misfortunes. Between that gap of a year, there has been a lot of difficulties, terrible catastrophic events, ups and downs, failures, misfortunes in the country. Anyone sitting there can feel deeply thankful for the great improvement in the position of their country and for their home. Now the situation is different. Now anyone sitting there in that school can deeply be thankful for the great improvement, for the great change that has taken place in the position of their country and for their home. They were quite desperately alone for 5 or 6 months and poorly armed. In the beginning of the war, they were alone, all alone, desperately alone. But it was only for 5 or 6 months. They were not well armed. They were poorly armed. But at the present, they are not so poorly armed. At present, they are well armed, well equipped. He consoles the peoples. His consolation to the peoples, consolation means samadhana. In spite of the improvement in their situation, there has been the unmeasured menace of the enemy and the air attack. Yes, the situation is quite improved now. Now they are quite stronger than before. Even though the people, especially the pupils or students, are still worried. In spite of the improvement, still there is unmeasured menace, trouble, destruction of the enemy. by the enemy, destruction of them by the enemy. There is still air attack is going on. Enemy has been destroying everything. The people themselves have the experience of that attack. Even the people's schools, colleges, which are restricted from the attacks, are also having the experience of the attack. They have begun to feel impatient about nothing being turned up. They are so frustrated, impatient, restless about nothing being turned up. He consoles them, I quote and unquote, to be equally good at what is short and sharp and what is long and tough. They should take everything equally, both the side equally. Happiness and difficulties, griefs. To be equally good at what is short and sharp and what is long and tough. The general opinion of the British. It is generally said the British are often better at the last. They do not expect to move from crisis to crisis, and each day will bring up some noble chance of war. British, though they begin slowly, but they end it properly. They are often better at the last. And they do not expect to increase problems, to move from crisis to crisis, and to expect a noble chance of war each day. They want to minimize the troubles, crisis. But if they make up their minds very slowly that the thing has to be done and put through and the job finished, then they do it even if it takes months or years. They may be slow beginners, but once they make up their mind, once they have made up their mind, decided to do something, decided to replace something or compensate something with something, though they begin slowly, they do it properly with proper preparation, and they finish the job even if it takes months or years. There is difference between their meeting before 10 months and at present. This is the evidence that he is presenting in front of them. Before 10 months, the situation was more difficult than now, more uncomfortable than now. They were weaker 10 months ago than now. They should learn a lesson that appearances are often deceptive. Though the situation has been improved, it appears in a different way. Only the worst part of the situation is seen everywhere. But he tells the students that appearances are often very deceptive. He quotes Rudyard Kipling's letter to his son. He advises his son in that poem, meet with triumph and disaster and treat those impostors just the same. He tells his son to take triumph and disaster equally. Meet both the triumph and disaster. ಜಯ ಮತ್ತು ಅಪಜಯ ಎರಡನ್ನೂ ಒಬ್ಬ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿ ಜೀವನದಲ್ಲಿ ಎದುರಿಸಬೇಕು. ಹೇಗೆ? ಟ್ರೀಟ್ ದೋಸ್ ಟು ಇಂಪೋಸ್ಟರ್ಸ್, ದೇ ಆರ್ ಇಂಪೋಸ್ಟರ್ಸ್, ದೇ ಆರ್ ಡಿಸೀಟ್ಫುಲ್ ಪರ್ಸನ್ಸ್ just the same. They deceive us. Triumph also, disaster also. ಜಯ ಅಪಜಯ ಎರಡನ್ನೂ ಸಮಸ್ಥಿತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಳ್ಳುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನು ಕಲಿಯಬೇಕು ಎಂದು ರುಡ್ಯಾರ್ಡ್ ಕಿಪ್ಲಿಂಗ್ ತನ್ನ ಮಗನಿಗೆ ಅಡ್ವೈಸ್ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತಾರೆ ಒಂದು ಕವನದಲ್ಲಿ. ರುಡ್ಯಾರ್ಡ್ ಕಿಪ್ಲಿಂಗ್ ಕೋಟ್ಸ್ ಹಿಯರ್ ಟು ಮೀಟ್ ಬೋತ್ ದ ಟ್ರಯಂಫ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಡಿಸಾಸ್ಟರ್, ಬ್ಯಾಡ್ ಸಿಚುಯೇಷನ್ and good situation with the same status of mind. Then he speaks of the importance of imagination. One should learn to imagine things and improve the power of imagination. They cannot tell from appearances how things would go. It's very difficult to say what is going on by just looking at the things on its surface. ಮೇಲ್ನೋಟಕ್ಕೆ ಪರಿಸ್ಥಿತಿಯನ್ನು ನೋಡಿ, ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿಗಳನ್ನ ನೋಡಿ, ಸಂದರ್ಭಗಳನ್ನ ನೋಡಿ ಅದು ಹೀಗೆ ಎಂದು ಹೇಳಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಯಾರಿಗೂ ಆಗಲ್ಲ. Then the imagination makes things out far worse than they are. If one has the power of imagination, the imagination makes things out far worse than they are. Imagination shows them the pictures of worse pictures of the situation than they are. Yet imagination is very much important, because imaginative people see many more dangers than those exist, and certainly many more than will happen. Yet he says imagination is very much important, because imaginative people see many more dangers than those exist. They can imagine more dangers than they exist, and they may imagine more than that will happen. That's good, but they must also pray for extra courage to carry that far-reaching imagination. At the same time, the people who imagine more dangers, more than what exists, also must learn to pray for extra courage to carry that far-reaching imagination. His lesson to the students who have gathered there: never give in. Never give in, never give in to something great or small, large or petty. Never give in, except to convictions of honor and good sense. Never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. I quote and unquote. He tells them never to surrender, never to be defeated. Never give in to nothing. To nothing, ಯಾವುದಕ್ಕೂ ಅವರು ಸೋಲೊಪ್ಪಿಕೊಳ್ಳಬೇಕಾಗಿಲ್ಲ. ವೆದರ್ ಇಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಗ್ರೇಟ್ ಆರ್ ಸ್ಮಾಲ್, ದೊಡ್ಡದಿರಲಿ ಸಣ್ಣದಿರಲಿ, ಲಾರ್ಜ್ ಆರ್ ಪೆಟಿ, ವಿಶಾಲವಾಗಿದ್ದಿರಲಿ ಸಣ್ಣದಿರಲಿ. ನೆವರ್ ಗಿವ್ ಇನ್. ದೇ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಟು ಗಿವ್ ಇನ್ ಓನ್ಲಿ ಟು ಕನ್ವಿಕ್ಷನ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಆನರ್. ಅವರು ಯಾವುದಕ್ಕೆ ತಲೆಬಾಗಬೇಕು, ಸೋಲಬೇಕು ಅಂದರೆ convictions of honor and good sense. To what should they give in? Convictions of honor and good sense. ಯಾವುದು ಗೌರವಯುತವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು, ಯಾವುದು ಒಳ್ಳೆಯ ಪ್ರಜ್ಞೆಯನ್ನು ಹೊಂದಿದೆ, ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಮಾತ್ರ ಅವರು ತಲೆಬಾಗಬೇಕು. ನೆವರ್ ಇಲ್ ಟು ಫೋರ್ಸ್. ಯಾವುದೇ ಒತ್ತಡಕ್ಕೆ, ಶಕ್ತಿಗೆ, ಬಲಪ್ರಯೋಗಕ್ಕೆ ಅವರು ಸೋಲಬಾರದು. ನೆವರ್ ಇಲ್ ಟು ದ ಅಪ್ಯಾರೆಂಟ್ಲಿ ಓವರ್ವೆಲ್ಮಿಂಗ್ ಮೈಟ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಎನಿಮಿ. The enemy is stronger than them. No, they should never surrender, never accept the defeat to the mighty strength of the enemy, overwhelming mighty of the enemy. ಬಲಪ್ರಯೋಗಕ್ಕೆ ಅವರು ಎಂದಿಗೂ ಶರಣಾಗಬಾರದು, ಸೋಲೊಪ್ಪಿಕೊಳ್ಳಬಾರದು, ಎದೆಗುಂದಬಾರದು. They should give in only to convictions of honor and good sense. Opinion of other countries a year ago. Now he draws a distinction between the opinion of other countries about Britain, the situation a year ago and now. A year ago they stood all alone. Many countries thought that their account was closed, they were finished. Many countries thought that Britain is alone and their account is over, they are finished. I quote and unquote. All this tradition of ours, our songs, our school history, this part of the history of this country were gone and finished and liquidated. They had thought that all this tradition of ours, our songs, our schools, this part of the history of this country, are gone and finished and liquidated. Other nations had thought that Britain had drawn a sponge across the slate. They are his words only. They had thought that Britain had drawn a sponge across the slate. Everything of the Britain has been wiped off, they had thought. But he says, instead, even though other countries had that opinion, even though Britain was alone 10 years ago, 10 months ago, their country has stood in a gap. In that gap of between 10 months, their country has stood, and there was no flinching and no thought of giving in. There was no question of giving in or being defeated. Present opinion of the other nations. What do the other nations think of Britain now? It seemed almost a miracle to those outside these islands. Now, the situation that Britain has taken into control, the improved situation of Britain has really surprised the other nations, and they say it is almost a miracle. Britain has achieved a miracle. Now they find themselves in a position that they can be sure that they have, I quote and unquote, only to persevere to conquer. Now they have nothing to do but persevere to conquer. Undergo some strong strength to face the situation with some perseverance, ability to withstand the difficulties. Perseverance means with strong ability to withstand the difficulties, Britain can conquer, only to persevere to conquer. With the permission of the headmaster, he wants to alter a word that they have sung in his honor. In their school, the school children have sung a song in his honor that had a line, I quote and unquote, not less we praise in darker days. He wants to change that line with the headmaster, because on the beginning of the day of a war, on the beginning day of the war, a year ago, it was the line, not less we praise in darker days. He wants to change this now as not less we praise in sterner days. He tells them not to speak of the darker days, but of sterner days. He tells them to speak of sterner days. I quote and unquote, these are not darker days. These are great days, the greatest days of our country has ever lived. And we must all thank God that we have been allowed, each of us according to our situations, to play a part in making these days memorable in the history of our race. He concludes with the statement that they should not think of darker days, sing of darker days. They should sing of sterner days, because these days are not darker days. According to him, these are great days, the greatest days that his country has ever lived. All of them must thank God that they have been allowed, each of them to, according to their status, to play a part in making these days memorable in the history of their race. These are not darker days. These are great days, the greatest days our country has ever lived, and we must all thank God that we have been allowed, each of us according to our situations. Stations means status, to play a part in making these days memorable in the history of our race. Here, he is advocating every one of them, the students, to develop a positive set of mind towards what has been taking place in their country. And they should thank God for giving them the opportunity, according to their status, to play a part in making these days a memorable days in the history of Britain, to contribute according to their status to the country in their situation. That's why he calls those days as the greatest days of his country. I acknowledge Winston S. Churchill's address to Harrow School, Never Given Speech, YouTube channel, Historical Speeches. Glossary. Given, admit. Defeat, surrender. Catastrophic, sudden and very great destruction. Peoples, students, menace, danger, risk, threat, crisis, crucial state of affairs, emergency. Make up, to compensate for, to replace, to decide. Impostors, deceitful persons, liquidated, dissolved, stern, firm, state, stations, status, position, bleak, cheerless, gloomy, mighty, strong. This speech has been prescribed to the third semester BCom course of Bangalore North University. Thank you for watching.